Well, good evening. My name's Graham Allison, and I'm glad to welcome you tonight to the ARCO Public Affairs Forum here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. And I'm especially pleased that Ambassador Tom Foley, who came off the plane from Japan to return to the U.S. on Sunday, is here with us. So let's welcome Tom. We have in the audience with us many members of the International Council of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, whom we welcome. And we're glad that Tom's old friend Lamar Alexander, who's teaching here at the school, is here as well. So I won't welcome you all, but I'll get to the topic here directly. The issue for the evening is provocatively put: Japan's future, a setting sun, question mark. Japan as number one. How many remember the title of a book, a best-selling book in the United States and Japan, authored by an American professor here at Harvard in 1979? As Ezra Vogel argued in that book, and I quote, "In the effectiveness of its institutions in coping with the current problems of the post-industrial era, Japan is indisputably number one." Just a decade later, Japan's bubble burst. A Nikkei stock index that had between 1980 and 1990 risen sixfold began a precipitous decline in which it fell to a 17-year low today at less than 13,000. As the Bank of Japan's Tankan report, released yesterday, noted, rapidly declining business confidence across all sectors of the Japanese economy reflects deepening skepticism among business leaders about the government's ability to steer the economy towards sustainable growth. Having skyrocketed to the point where at one point the Imperial Palace grounds were valued at more than all the land in the state of California, Tokyo property values have crashed back to earth. In the last several years, the professional community of scholars' analysis of Japan has turned, focusing on deep structural and economic problems in Japan. Mike Porter and Hirotaka Takeuchi argue in their book, "Can Japan Compete?" that Japan's activist government policy explains Japan's failures more than its successes, that the collapse of the Japanese bubble exposed a fundamentally flawed system, and that no vision for a future Japan has emerged and no political leadership has come forward to articulate and implement it. A recent McKinsey study piled on this analysis, concluding, and again I quote, "In a misguided effort to protect jobs and maintain stability, the government subsidizes the inefficient players and blocks the entry of competitors." Underlying these economic difficulties, analysts point to a political paralysis and rot as the roots of the problem. LDP-dominated governments of timid placeholders have overseen a policy of wait and hope. While Japan needs, it's argued, a vigorous clean out of the bank loans books and managements, liberalization of farm trade, deregulation and proper antitrust enforcement in telecom and a myriad of other sectors, there is no current prospect of this or anything like it happening, or so says the recent Economist. Most disturbingly, many senior Japanese have become even gloomier about their country. A big takeaway for me from last month's Trilateral Commission meeting in London was the depth of pessimism very thoughtful Japanese expressed about Japan's future. If the pessimists are proved right, the implications will be profound. in a geopolitical era that most have expected to be shaped by the rise of one great power, China, and the sharp decline of another, Russia, prolonged stagnation or even decline of a third great power would produce a tsunami with major consequences, not only for Asia, but all around the world. Now, wise stock market hands have a saying that when everyone becomes pessimistic, that's a sign that the market may have reached a bottom. Or to repeat the metaphor for the evening, after the sunset, fortunately, we wake up the next morning to a sunrise. So to illuminate this question, is Japan's sun setting, we've assembled an extraordinary panel, and we're very fortunate to have them here with us. I'm going to start with a question for Ambassador Foley. Tom Foley has been ambassador to Japan for the past 4 years, and as I say, literally has returned to the U.S. from his post only on Sunday. He'll be rejoining his law firm in Washington, but fortunately for those of us here at the Kennedy School, be spending a day a week with us at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs in a relationship that we hope will drag him to Cambridge pretty soon, though he's not decided about that yet. Before serving as ambassador to Japan, he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and for many years before that, a distinguished member of Congress. So we're very fortunate to have a person who's been right in the middle of this set of issues, and very effectively so, over the past 4 years, and who's been thoughtful about the broader subjects, like the one we're addressing tonight, as one of the great American political thinking leaders. So we're glad to have Tom Foley with us.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. I'm Alison San, as we would say. I'm in advance somewhat apologetic for having arrived in the United States 2 days ago, and I found that there is a kind of a correlation between age and jet lag, that it takes progressively longer for me to recover from jet lag as I get a little older, and I'm still in sort of the middle of the jet lag. But let me say it's a great pleasure to be here tonight, to be at the Belfer Center, and to be with such a distinguished panel. I have an intuitive, if not completely well-schooled belief that those who believe that Japan's sun is setting are wrong. That is not only based on sort of my reaction over watching Japan for a number of years. I first started going to Japan in the late 1960s. And at that time, I marveled at the success that Japan had achieved in the 60s in rising out of the terrible destruction of the end of the Second World War. John Dower has written a brilliant book called Embracing Defeat, which describes the conditions in Japan at the end of World War II. There was literally starvation. There was a total destruction of the infrastructure. Families were separated. The country was totally devastated. Japanese citizens had been told that the arriving Americans would rape and murder everyone. Women would be raped, men would be shot, in order to build up a sense of resistance to the expected American onslaught. There's a poignant story about a woman who was injured in some kind of combat situation in Japan, and suddenly she was, as she thought, attacked by 2 Americans who began to rip her clothes off, to put sulfa and antibiotics on her wound, and to bind them up. And that was the beginning of a realization that Japan and the United States had a new and different relationship. And that relationship has led to not only an integration of our economies, the 2 largest economies in the world, but an extraordinary security relationship, which I think remains the most important, in my view today, security relationship between the United States and any country in the world. So Is the indictment that Graham just read from a number of sources true? I think in many cases it is true. Japan has a politically dysfunctional system, in my judgment. I don't think the Japanese political system is serving Japan well. It's an imperfect democracy. Indeed, ours is imperfect, but for different reasons. Japan has had a ruling party, or now a ruling coalition, that has had the advantage of extraordinarily fractionated and weak opposition. In the United States, we have two parties that are pretty muscular and ready to take advantage each of the slips of the other. In Japan, in part, frankly, because of the presence of the Communist Party, which takes 5 to 10% of the vote away from any possible coalition of opposition. The Liberal Democratic Party has, along with its partners in the present coalition, had a fairly easy time of keeping control of the Diet. That may not be true after the 29th of July, when they face a very stiff challenge in the upper house elections. Why is the political system important? Because many Japanese today are really as turned off on the politics of their country as Americans were not a few years ago. And many believe that the political system has no particular capacity to direct Japan into the next decade or decades. Consequently, a country which has, by some estimates, 30% of the world's savings, and depending on currency exchange rates, somewhere between 12 and 14 trillion dollars, not yen, we're talking dollars, of household savings, has been unable to get consumption levels up. And Japan, like the United States, has about 60% of its gross domestic product in consumer spending. So this is a tragedy for the recovery of the Japanese economy. With all these challenges, a political system that lacks public confidence, an economy that can't seem to do the things that are necessary, including clearing out the bad loans and disposing of the real estate that's behind it, welcoming foreign investment fully and enthusiastically, deregulating the economy, doing all the things that, frankly, not only the United States, but many other countries have urged Japan to do. Why do I think that the sun is not setting? First of all, because the picture is not quite as black and white as the critics indicate. Japan is doing some things, although it's doing them too slowly and it's doing them too half-heartedly. It still has the capacity to do them better, if not do them as well as we had hoped. The financial sector, for example, in Japan, has been opened reasonably well to foreign direct investment. He's here tonight, so I don't want to use him as an example, but Tim Collins and Ripplewood Holdings acquired the Long-Term Credit Bank last year in Japan and reorganized it. That could not have happened 10 years before in Japan. Could not have happened for a totem institution of Japan to be taken over by basically a foreign consortium. Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, Merrill Lynch, Cargill. You can go on and list the American firms that have done extraordinarily well as a result of the so-called Hashimoto Big Bang in the financial services area. In IT, there is still a struggle underway as to whether NTT will stifle the economic development of this vital sector of Japan or will not. And it's a case that still is undecided. And there is a risk that NTT will eventually become the sort of big bully on the street that will prevent foreign investors in this very interesting and important sector from moving forward. Japan has great capacities in this field. If you look, as I do, coming back to the United States, at what Americans carry around as cell phones and what you experienced in Japan they're about a third of the size of a cigarette pack. They have about 22 different ways, the average one, of telling you a call is coming in. My personal bodyguard decided to have the Star Spangled Banner, the first 5 or 6 bars of the Star Spangled Banner play. But you can get the Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. You can get Pachelbel's Canon. You can get Mozart, anything you want, and a system that works extraordinarily well throughout the country. They now have, of course, email. JPhone and IMAX and so on provide internet connections, and the Japanese are rapidly pushing this wireless field ahead as a standard of the world. So I think there are important opportunities in the Japanese economy. Our strategic relationship, just to say for a moment, is probably as important as it's ever been in my judgment. We have 47,000, actually about 50,000 troops in Japan, 17,000 Marines in Okinawa. We have naval and air forces there. And in a changing security situation in Asia, I think the reasons for the presence of American forces in Japan is as strong as it's ever been, maybe even stronger. But Japan is going through a period of reconsideration, I think, of its relationship to the alliance. Many young Japanese questioned whether the alliance was relevant after the end of the Cold War. On August 31st, 1998, the North Koreans fired a Taepodong missile over Japan, and suddenly the country was kind of galvanized to remember that maybe there were threats, and suddenly it became less critical of the elements of Japan. Society became less critical of the security relationship. Now again, with the possibility of peace breaking out in the Korean Peninsula, people are asking questions. Is this security relationship necessary or not? I'm not going to argue the case, but just I think a fact. With all the enthusiasm of the summit between Kim Jong-il and Kim Dae-jung, the security situation has not improved in the Korean Peninsula in any marked degree as far as I know. There's probably more maneuvering of North Korean troops near the border than there's ever been. There are just as many forces there as there's ever been. And to some extent, skepticism about how much the North Koreans have done in response to the world's rush to recognize the regime is I think a good question. Anyway, the best policy perhaps is caution and prudence. Why do I have confidence that the Japanese sun is not setting? Because I think Japan was the most extraordinary example in the second half of the 20th century of a people rising from defeat against overwhelming odds and applying some important but very limited resources, mostly human resources, and determination and will, to making a small country without very many natural resources of any kind the second largest economy in the world. That didn't happen accidentally. Those capacities still exist. Japan needs to do a number of things. The list is very long of what it needs to do. But I think there is historic evidence that at some point, sometimes very late, but at some point, the Japanese organize their national consensus to do what is necessary. And then they are extraordinary in getting those things done. And I, again, mostly by intuition rather than evidence, believe that that time is still available to Japan. One of the things you're told when you are an English speaker in Japan is never use analogies because they're very hard to translate. Inevitably, we all fall into the practice. And I found myself one time saying, we have an expression in English, every cloud has a silver lining. And the simultaneous interpreter looked at me with what is close to Japanese hatred as I've seen. And she said something in Japanese. And I asked a Japanese-speaking friend, what did she say? How did she translate, every cloud has a silver lining? She translated it, behind every dark cloud shines the sun. I thought that was an improvement on the original. It was more poetic, it was just as expressive, a little bit different than the idea, but pretty close. I think Japan is going through a dark cloud. But behind the dark cloud, I think, still shines the sun. If China achieves all of its goals for expanding its economy in the next decade, and doubles the size of the GDP of China. And Japan does nothing, just stays flat. The Japanese economy will be more than twice the size of the Chinese economy 10 years from now. China is a country of great population and size. Japan is the economic giant of Asia. And even though it may grow less than 1%, if it grows at all, it will be, I think, the continued large economic presence in Asia for as long as I can see. And it is a partner and an ally, which, in my judgment, has been as reliable as any we have ever had in our history. I'm sometimes accused of being too friendly to Japan. When I went to Tokyo, one of the authors of an article in Business Week said that the worst possible place to send me was to Japan, because I was too friendly to the Japanese, and they would get anything they wanted. And at my hearing, I quoted Mike Mansfield. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State with Ronald Reagan, used to like to take ambassadors and sit them down next to his desk and twirl a great global globe, the old-fashioned globe, and say, "Ambassador, show me your country," meaning show me where you've been assigned, where you've been posted. And Mike Mansfield stopped it at the United States, near a large western state, and said, "Mr. Secretary, this is my country." And I told the Senate, I think I know, where my country is. But I think I also know, frankly, after serving in Japan for 3.5 years, who our strongest friend in Asia is. And that is Japan. And I think those who wish that country well, as I do, also wish our own country well. And it is a country of extraordinary capacities and extraordinary problems. But at the end of the day, I think the capacities are going to outweigh the problems. The Japanese sun will rise again.
Good. I think Tom has laid out for our commenters the whole panoply, and we're going to go first to dig in a little bit on the economic dimension, then on the political dimension, and then on the security dimension and the more general geopolitical picture. Bob Lawrence, a professor here at the Kennedy School, has just returned from service on the Council of Economic Advisors in Washington and is a distinguished professor of international economics here. And Bob has looked at this set of issues both globally and specifically in the context of Japan. So I would put to you, Bob, a question about the economy. As you look at this picture and you take the analyses like Porter or McKinsey or the new conventional wisdom, and you think about that story, what do you say?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that Japan basically has three very deep, fundamental problems. Firstly, it has a business cycle problem. It has deflation, high unemployment. Secondly, it has a financial system that has huge amounts of non-performing loans, is essentially on the verge of bankruptcy. And thirdly, it has these structural problems. The economy is not competitive. Competition has been felt very strongly in Japanese manufacturing because it was exposed to international trade, but the rest of the economy has basically been sheltered. And the fundamental issue is that it's in the rest of the economy that the future lies. It's in services. It's in information technology. It's in wholesale and retail trade. So there are these three fundamental problems. And what makes this so difficult is that dealing with, if a country had just one of these, it would be problematic. But because they have all three, dealing with any one of them becomes increasingly difficult. It's very difficult to restructure in an economy which has recession. What do you do with the people who are displaced? It's very difficult to restructure your banks in a sense when their customers or the loans don't have a future because the economy has to restructure. It's very difficult to apply monetary policy to stimulate the economy if the financial system doesn't work. So there is an interaction in which somehow the parts are less than the sum of the whole, or whatever the expression goes. I'm changing the sign. So that there is a vicious circumstance which would require comprehensive action simultaneously on numerous fronts. The problem is, as I see it, that as most human beings do when faced with really large problems, the first response is denial. And basically, the Japanese leaders have lived in fundamental denial, minimizing the problems in the hope that they'll just go away. So that it took until 97 to take decisive action in the banking area. It took far too long for the Bank of Japan to switch from fighting a bubble and inflation to realizing what its real problem was to restore economic growth. It's taken deregulation far too long to be implemented. So that's denial. The second thing people do generally, I guess, is when they want to avoid a problem, is they blame. They blame one another. And there is a spectacle of blame among Japanese officials which destroys people's confidence that there's a coherent strategy. One of the hallmarks, if I might say, of the administration of which I was part was that the Treasury and the Federal Reserve were never at loggerheads during the 8 years of the Clinton administration. The markets heard a coherent message, and that was extremely critical in getting a message out to the public. What we have in Japan is passing of the buck. The Bank of Japan doesn't want to stimulate. It would prefer for a structural change to occur. The politicians in particular don't want the restructuring sometimes, but don't want it to go on too long. In a sense, a lot of name calling. So blame is a second normal human reaction. A third reaction is to declare victory without having actually achieved success, when things look a little better. And that has also been a chronic tendency with very detrimental impact. The Ministry of Finance raising taxes before the recovery had taken hold in 97. In financial reconstruction, doing some decisive things in 97, 98, and then stopping the process, not really taking care of the fundamental problem. So the Bank of Japan's behavior in interest rate policy, raising interest rates in last August before the recovery had truly taken hold. So reacting too quickly to heave a sigh of relief. This is, as I say, a deep problem. It does require concentrated action. And I think in a society where it's extremely difficult for the government to impose losses, to recognize losses. The whole great strength of Japan is consensus. The whole great strength of Japan is solidarity. Well, we have a set of problems in which there are going to be very big losers. If the banking system is bankrupt, how do you deal with it? Well, are you going to hit the people who hold equity in the banks? Are you going to hit the depositors? Are you going to hit the borrowers? If you don't inflict damage on one of those three groups, it's going to be the taxpayer. So you're going to have to impose losses if you take care of the banking system's problem. And it's politically extremely unpopular. The same would be true for the structural changes that have to take place. So I think you have deeply rooted challenges, and you have a great political difficulty in imposing the costs. So what has happened is crises have been responded to too little, too late. Instead of sort of getting ahead of the curve, what's happened is decisions are made where the policymakers are dragged kicking and screaming, and they have no alternative. And what's been happening in the last month is very, very typical. The market started to tumble. The Bank of Japan suddenly decided that it needed to reverse its course, but it didn't quite go in the radical direction that I believe it needed to, which was, in fact, to do something dramatic like taking on an inflation target, but rather some rather tentative moves which need to be interpreted. No one quite knows what they really mean, but moving tentatively. So I think it does take comprehensive radical action simultaneously on numerous fronts. Restructuring, deregulation. By the way, one of the worst things I believe you can do is to talk about deregulation and the changes to come and then not to implement them. If you're not going to implement them, don't talk about them. Because what you do in that kind of a framework is you create a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Those who are going to be on the losing side are not going to invest because they know deregulation is coming. Those who will be the winners are not going to enter because they're not yet allowed to enter. So you're not creating winners by talking about structural change and not actually implementing it sufficiently rapidly. I think you're far worse off. You have to hit a bottom. Graham mentioned this question about the market hitting bottom. Everybody knows that there are non-performing loans and that these are collateralized by real estate. So everyone in the real estate market is waiting for the time in which the situation is going to be resolved, and all of this property, all the collateral, is going to be dumped onto the market. Until people are convinced you've hit a bottom, you're not going to see the sun rising. So that's why I think you have to have radical action. It's got to be a combination of fiscal commitments, but not in the way they've been doing it with large government spending. I think tax cuts are far more preferable and should be used. I think monetary policy should have an inflation target. I wouldn't worry too much about the, now that I'm not an official, I would say it, I wouldn't worry too much about the exchange rate, which I believe is going to weaken under any circumstance. And then I think you have to have the comprehensive treatment of the non-performing loans in the financial system and the deregulation, as you can see, a rather tall order. Will we see it? Actually, I emerge fairly pessimistic about the prospects. I think Ambassador Foley was absolutely right about the capacity of the Japanese people to act in a crisis. I think the Second World War was indeed a devastating crisis. I think when those iron-bottom boats arrived in the harbor in the last century, that was a challenge which was unmistakable for Japan. I think when the oil shock hit, it was an unmistakable crisis. But I think today there is a capacity for that system, which some say has flexible rigidities, for the system to bend but not to break, to accommodate but not to be fundamentally transformed. But I think it's dysfunctional at this point. And so my best bet is they'll muddle along and take the half kind of measures which are designed to placate. My best hope, ironically, and something which I wouldn't put a large bet on, is that there is some fundamental crisis which actually forces dramatic action. Because I do believe ultimately the Japanese have great potential. I do think you have a country with immense savings and indeed a huge investment opportunity, both in Japan and outside of Japan. I also would conclude that we used to have this wonderful image of the flying geese, where Japan was going to be the lead goose in Asia, and the other geese would fly behind it. But it is imperative for Japan to take care of its problems so that goose not become an albatross. So that in effect, this, the adjustment in Japan not have a devastating impact on the rest of Asia. We need a healthy Japan. The Asians need a healthy Japan. So it is in our interest to see that those fundamental changes are actually implemented.
Good. Thank you, Bob. I think that you've rounded out the economic side of this. We have now the sun, the cloud, the goose, and the albatross. So, Susan, we're coming to you. Susan Farr is the Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics here at Harvard and the director of the U.S.-Japan program and an expert on Japanese politics and comparative politics. So we asked Susan to talk about, in particular, the setting sun question mark from the political perspective, and particularly the diagnoses that root the problem in the politics.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. I'm delighted to be here. I guess I was struck by, we're here talking about political stalemate, a term that Graham used earlier. But what's so surprising to me, in a way, is that we are talking about stalemate, because if we cast our mind back a bit and go back to around 1993, that was the point, by the way, where I was first met, I believe, Ambassador Foley, when he was still on the Hill, and he and I were part of a briefing session for President Clinton before President Clinton's first trip to Japan. And I remember the feeling of being on the brink of really some very profound and positive changes in Japanese politics at that time. So where were we, just to give some perspective on this? Well, back in 1993, the Liberal Democratic Party, after 38 years of almost continuous, virtually unbroken rule, was clearly in a crisis. New parties were appearing across the political spectrum, mainly breakaway parties from the conservative camp, but it looked as if there were new political faces on the scene. There was a whole sense, there was talk of Japan eventually having a two-party system, and a great many political analysts back in 1993 were predicting that. And there was a general feeling that bureaucracy would be gradually moved aside, and what we would see is the politicians move to center stage. But when you look if you're 8 years later where we are, you have 6 prime ministers in 8 years. You have a current prime minister with one of the lowest time ever approval ratings in the single digits. And we have a series of economic measures that most people would regard as woefully inadequate. And if you think why that is, I think it's several things. One of them is, if you are a political scientist and certainly someone concerned about politics here at the Kennedy School, you know how difficult it is for new parties to become a name brand, to get loyalty from constituents, to find issues that win over the allegiance of a new group of people. And these new parties have had a tremendously difficult time finding issues, getting loyalty, getting financial support. And meanwhile, the Liberal Democratic Party, which came back into power after less than 2 years, it has been nevertheless greatly weakened, so that whereas in the past it had handled many of the very crises that Bob was referring to, such as the oil crises and yen appreciation in 1985 and so on, basically it was so weakened in a coalition that it has been very difficult to act. But I think the most fundamental problem has to do with the lack of a political mandate from the public. In other words, imagine if you're a Japanese voter. You have had 40 years of economic policies that basically represent changes beyond your wildest dreams if you compare your situation with that of your parents. Economic policies that led to what many people still today refer to as the Japanese economic miracle. Then you have a downturn in the 1990s, and there is a growing realization that if there are to be changes in Japan, they will be profound changes that will put at risk some of the sort of cornerstones of the entire economic system that was put in place over the post-war period, and job security being one of them, a cornerstone of everything people have organized their educational life, the exam system, everything is built upon job security. And suddenly then you have to think, are you prepared to throw your lot with profound reforms when you don't know that they will work? And in the absence of a consensus in the public that Japan is in that state, then people have been clinging to the past, angry, frustrated, but unwilling to accept major kinds of reforms. And meanwhile, weakened political parties, any one of the opposition parties still too weak, and the LDP itself also very weak today. They've been clinging to what they have and worried in this electoral reform that occurred in 1993, worried about simply staying in power, and therefore they have not felt able to seize this issue and incur the costs that are inevitably going to go with it, because everyone recognizes that if things are to change, things will get much worse before they get better. And here we're talking about layoffs, people being fired, bankruptcies. All of this would be part of a major reform initiative. So I think in the absence of that consensus within Japan, for the very reason some of you have talked about, I think that has kept things very slow in terms of the ability of leaders to seize this issue and to really address it in a definitive way that the public can accept. Well, what about in the long term? How do I feel? I come down, I guess, somewhere between both Tom and Bob, in the sense that I don't have quite the optimism, I think, of Ambassador Foley. But I think that, and I do agree with Tom that, with Bob, that in the short run, what we're going to have is a very, very muddling through kind of situation. I do not yet see the political will on the politician side, nor do I see the will on the public side to accept profound change. And meanwhile, it's the bureaucrats in the past who, maligned as they are today, who have been the architects of Japanese economic policy, but they have been so deeply discredited by scandals that they too have been sidelined as reformers in a period in which reform is so greatly needed. So, and of course they are part of the problem. But what about in the long term? Well, my own work is more on the social and political transformations looking over the long term in Japan. And I have to say that from that perspective, I am far more optimistic. Take, for example, why is there so much turmoil in Japanese politics and bureaucracy today? Well, one of the reasons is incredible numbers of corruption scandals. So you think, is this a bad thing? Well, the fact of the matter is, these were long overdue. And many of Japan's fundamental problems grew out of overly cozy relations between bureaucrats and business, in which basically accountants looked the other way on bad loans, and auditors looked the other way on bad loans, and so on, because they all were from the same university. They were too close to each other. And so the corruption scandals that are surfacing now, in that sense, I think are a cleaning out of the house that in fact has to occur before Japan is going to reform. If we talk about other changes, one would be that if from the local level to the national level in Japan, one of the key things one hears about is information disclosure. There is a tremendous pressure today for more information on the part of the public about what is happening in Japanese politics. And this involves, just a simple example, there were 500 scandals several years ago involving what's called kankan setai, bureaucrats wining and dining other bureaucrats on the public tab. And this surfaced because in the local and prefectures, local citizens groups were going and accessing for the first time the financial records of the bureaucrats at the local level to see what they were paying in wining and dining people in Tokyo to try to bring perks back to their prefecture. And the point is that this kind of information disclosure gives citizens more power in the system. If you look at civil society today, the sheer number of groups, including international groups that are concerned about issues like climate control, climate change, and so on, that number has grown greatly in the over the last 10 years. Japan has passed an NGO law in 1998 that makes it easier to have not-for-profit organizations. So these are all signs, and just as one other of a great deal, I think, in other words, you could pull together these very, very small signs, some large, some small, into a pattern of change, and I'll just mention one or two others. One is, for example, there's a move right now in the legislature, in the Diet, to give citizens, give non-citizens, who are in Japan are largely Korean Japanese, people living in Japan who are Korean Japanese today, but not citizens, to give them voting rights in local elections. This has happened in only 16 countries of the world, most of them, some of the most progressive countries, the Scandinavian countries and so on, but this is a move in Japan. And this corrects a long overdue situation in which Korean Japanese have suffered a great deal of discrimination. But in other words, these are types of long-term trends that I believe will make Japan, in the end, a better democracy.
So thank you very much, Susan. I don't know whether we have another metaphor, but we have at least another ray of optimism. Our cleanup hitter is the school's dynamic dean, and distinguished professor, Joe Nye, who in his other lives served as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, where he was responsible, among other things, for something that came to be called the Nye Initiative, which rebalanced the relationship between the U.S. and Japan and reaffirmed the U.S.-Japanese Mutual Security Treaty and that alliance as the foundation for stability in Asia. So Joe will tell us a little bit about the security dimensions of it and any other items you want to do in the wrap-up of the first round. We'll let Tom say what he agrees or disagrees with from the others, and then we're going to come to the audience very briefly. So Joe.
When you look at the security situation in Asia, you'll notice it's very different from Europe. When the Cold War ended in Europe, the historic enemies, Germany and France, were allies, military allies in NATO, were economically tied together in the European Union. If you look at the situation in Asia when the Cold War ended, China and Japan basically still had mistrust left over from the 1930s. And if you try then to understand what's been happening in Asia, you've had a tremendous rise in the power of China, where China has tripled its gross national product in 20 years. That's quite an extraordinary thing to accomplish. And it's also been increasing its military expenditures. Last year, it increased to about 17%. This means that if you look at the question of a balance of power in East Asia, it really rests on three countries, the U.S., China, and Japan. And the key question is whether the U.S. and Japan will maintain their political and military alliance so that they can cope with the rise of Chinese power in a positive way. A Japan, a China, and a U.S. triangle is the basis for stability in East Asia. A stable East Asia will have rapid economic growth, which can bring about benefits for everybody, including gradual transformation. That triangle is essential. It's important not to isolate or ostracize China, but it's also important that the U.S. and Japan, at the base of that triangle, remember that they have an alliance. So it's not an equilateral triangle. It's a triangle where the Japanese-American leg is an alliance. And from that position of strength, the U.S. and Japan can work with China so that China, as its power evolves, can be a responsible nation in the region. And I think that's the conception for how you have stability in East Asia. It's going to be difficult. It's not always easy. There are problems such as the one we're going through right now with the airplane incident with China. But I think the important thing is that if the U.S.-Japan alliance holds, it's likely that there will be stability in the region. For one thing, if you look at the Japanese from the military point of view, they actually are quite impressive. Indeed, if you were a person from Mars and you were suddenly landed on the East Asian part of Earth and said, now, here's a blindfold, you can pick this country or that country, C and J, and I'll list for you all the assets of C in the military area, and I'll list for you all the assets of J in the military area, and then you choose which one you want. You'd be crazy if you didn't choose J. Japan has modern forces of great capability. China has a much larger army. It also has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have the combined forces capabilities. It doesn't have the modern command and control. It doesn't have nearly the capability that Japan has. Now, Japan is constrained by its constitution that it will not have an external aggressive intent or capability, and I think that's important. I don't urge that the Japanese should revise their constitution, though that's an issue that's on the agenda in Japan. I don't see militarism rising in Japan. I mean, there are a few people with sound trucks on the right wing who occasionally make some noise, but there really isn't deep Japanese militarism. This is not the Japan of the 1930s, but a Japan which is capable in working with the U.S. of balancing Chinese power and accommodating the Chinese as their power grows, I think plays an extraordinarily important role in the region. A Japan which were to turn inward, to turn away from this role, I think would be a great loss for the region. Now, is there a danger that Japan will become too aggressive? Some of my Chinese friends worry about this. I don't think so. I do think Japan has changed and is not a militaristic nation. On the other hand, I think it would be useful if Japan were to play a role in supporting United Nations peacekeeping more strongly than it now does. Japan has worked on UN peacekeeping operations in Cambodia, in Mozambique, elsewhere. This is important. They've set themselves up with very tight restraints on when they can participate. I think it would help if they'd loosen those a bit. But by and large, I think the idea of seeing Japan as a country which has a great deal to contribute to security, both in the region and globally, is something that is an asset for Japan, but also something that Japan can contribute to the world. So I would argue that if one looks at the Japanese situation in a security perspective, over the last 10 years, actually things have improved very much. Tom Foley and I were at a Shimoda conference, I think it was in '91, right after the Gulf War. And the great problem the Japanese had then was, would the Diet pass a law which will allow them to take part in peacekeeping operations? The very idea that Japan could do anything to contribute to security in the world was virtually a taboo. Now, Japan does participate in peacekeeping operations. Japan is capable of contributing to security. I think there's, as I mentioned, a distance to go, but I think if you look at the slow and gradual steps that Japan has made since over the last 10 years, these are positive steps. Not aggressive, not threatening, but moving to contribute more toward international security. Ideally, at some day, Japan will be a member of the Security Council of the United Nations. Politics makes it hard to tell when that will happen. But I think the general view that Japan is a country in decline, I think there are real problems in the economy, as Robert said, but I think in terms of Japan's beginning to live up to its responsibilities in international security, actually the progress has been in the right direction. And if you compare the strength of the U.S.-Japan alliance today to what it was 10 years ago, much stronger. We had the Clinton-Hashimoto Declaration in 1996 saying that the alliance was reaffirmed. You have public opinion polls that show, despite the concerns about Okinawa and other areas about how much of this is in my backyard, there's still a 2/3 of the Japanese public that supports the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And you have the implementation of defense guidelines to put practical basis for U.S. and Japanese cooperation. So I'd argue that without disagreeing with some of the problems on the economic side, that in the security side, actually Japan has been making progress. Just to sum up, though, and to turn away from the security area and take Graham's invitation to make a comment to provoke, perhaps, I tend a little bit toward Tom Foley's optimism over the long run. Japan is really quite an extraordinary country. It's the first country in Asia, indeed I think the first country in the developing world of 150 years ago to have accepted globalization and profited from it. 150 years ago, Japan was the first country that really embraced globalization and turned it to strengthening Japan. It's quite remarkable. Japan chose deliberately to pick and choose from around the world, and in the process of less than 40 years, it had done that so successfully that it could defeat an European great power in the Russo-Japanese War. Obviously, it overdid it a bit. There was defeat in World War II, but Japan then again, with another strategy, essentially became the country which went from made in Japan being a term of derision to Made in Japan being a preferred label, at least in certain areas of manufacturing. An extraordinary movement to the #2 economy in the world from what had been a devastated post-World War II economy. Japan is now in the doldrums. I don't disagree with the thing that Robert Lawrence said, but if somebody said, now place your bets on 10 or 15 years from now, will Japan go downward or will it bottom out and rise upward again? I wouldn't sell Japan short. In fact, this is the time when I, to go back to Graham's metaphor, would buy Japan.
Okay, good. Thank you, John. The way the evening works now is we give an opportunity for questions from the audience, and while you're lining up at one of the two microphones, I'm going to ask one of our guests, Tim Collins, since Joe said he would buy Japan, just to make a please, Tim, if you would, a brief comment, because Ambassador Foley already mentioned, Tim is a member of the International Council who actually has bought a piece of Japan, the long-term credit bank. So use the microphone here.
I guess I
You're
would
positive or negative, you must be.
I'm in the intermediate term, ultra optimistic. I think Japan is on an inflection point. I frankly disagree with both the diagnosis and the prescription. I think Japan, the manufacturing economy, will pull it out. It's right at the point of restructuring and inflection. And, we've obviously made our bet. We bet, $1.2 billion that it's going to turn around. So I'm incredibly optimistic.
It's more than that.
Good. So much for the pessimist. Okay. Let's go here to this side and please introduce your. Oh, sorry.
You were going to give me a chance to.
Yes. Sorry. Hold 1 second. Let Tom agree or disagree, and then we're coming to you. Yep.
Very quickly, it's awkward to agree with everybody. I agree with every other word that was said by the panel. I think if you want to be more pessimistic than Professor Lawrence, you can start to talk about demography, about the fact that Japan is aging faster than any other society in the world. In the United States in 2020, 1 of every 5 people will be over 65. The U.S. will be Florida. In Japan, that'll happen in 2015, and by figures of not 20, but 25%. Recently, the last of 2 Japanese famous twin sisters died. They were called Jin-san and Kin-san, gold and silver in Japan. Silver and gold, actually. And they wore different colored slippers to identify themselves. They were very old people. They were 107 in one case and 108 in the next case before they died, but they were very bright. And they asked Jin-san one time, why do you and your sister appear on television so much, Jin-san? She's 106 when this question is asked. She said, well, to make money, of course. To make money. Well, why do you need to make money? Well, because Kin-san and I are getting older, we have to prepare for old age. But Japan's aging society presents some very real challenges to the country. It has to become extraordinarily more productive in order to maintain a standard of living as the labor force shrinks, as the cost of social security, including medical care particularly, rises very drastically. Pete Peterson has written a very interesting book called The Gray Dawn, I think is the title of it, and it describes the problems that many societies have in this area. Japan has an extraordinary problem. By the way, I think one of his friends described this book as one that if you put down, you can't pick up.
It's true.
I think it's not the most interesting book to read, but it's an important book.
What year did we become Florida?
Yeah. We become Florida in 2020.
Please, introduce yourself and put your question or point.
My name is Masanori Tsuruda, first year here at Kennedy School. My question is about Japanese position in U.S.-China relations, especially in the context of Taiwan Strait issues. Suppose that arms sale in question recently is determined by the administration this month. Do you think any impact to the Japanese and China relations, or more in general, how much does the administration care about its impact to the Japanese-China relations when they shape or determine the critical issue concerning on U.S.-China relations?
The sale to Taiwan and the impact on Japan and how much we take into account. the impact on Japan, the Chinese-Japanese relationship. You having just come off of the hot seat, you
Yeah,
might.
well, actually,
he's
Japan,
transitioning quickly to speaking more
Japan and
more
the United
directly.
States have very similar problems in this area. Technically speaking, both the United States and Japan have the same formal policy toward China. We have a one-China policy, both countries. We urge the mainland China and Taiwan to resolve their difficulties by peaceful means. Japan is probably even more interested in that, since they're a little closer to a potential conflict. On the other hand, in Japan today, there are very strong forces that are supportive of Taiwan. And there is I don't want to use a pejorative word, there is a pro-Taiwan lobby in the Diet that is very effective and very strong. The most charismatic politician in Japan today, and I won't say how desirable this is, but the most charismatic politician in Japan today is the governor of Tokyo, Ishihara. And Governor Ishihara is an outspoken supporter of Taiwan and critic of China. He has used the word Shina, which is a pejorative word in Japanese toward China. And when I went to see him, a brief anecdote if I can be, when I went to see him after he was elected governor, I was really worried that he was going to hit me up for the return of Yokota Air Base and the return of Yokosuka Naval Base, and more particularly those areas in Tokyo. And I walked in to see him, and he said, I hope this is not violating your confidence. He said, I've talked about these things, our demands for the return of American properties in Tokyo, that I think are Japanese properties, including golf courses and air bases and helicopter stations, and I'll talk about them again. But what I want to tell you today, Ambassador, is how ashamed I am that Japan did not stand with the United States when it sent elements of the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Straits in 1996. The United States did the brave and right thing, and we should have stood behind you more aggressively and so on. Now, I'm not saying that for the validity of it, but there is a very, very strong element. And when you have a person that I believe, if you had the direct election of the prime minister, would be the next prime minister of Japan. And that is not necessarily, you'll have to make your own judgment, let me put it that way, whether that's a good thing or not. But the voice of Taiwan is getting stronger in Japan, probably.
Okay. So Harold, and then the lady. Harold Heston.
Thank you. Tom, as a casual participant in U.S.-Japanese business affairs, at first I thought they didn't know balance sheet accounting. I looked at the financial statements of the Japanese banks. I couldn't find anything resembling equity. I wondered how they can suggest that they comport with the Basel Convention on, having some equity. And perhaps I missed the numbers. Then I thought, well, these people just, in terms of macroeconomics, don't know what the hell they're doing. Then I got to know the people at MIDI, and through the school, quite frankly, Ministry of Finance, and I found that the Japanese are about as bright and well-trained and aware of economic reality as any group I have ever encountered. Which leads me to the concern that, to use an analogy, and I know, Tom, you don't like analogies, are they headed for a Chapter 7 rather than a Chapter 11? That is, culturally, can they face up, they understand what the reality is, but is it that they simply can't face up to it and have to see a crash and then hope to put the pieces back together?
I think that's a good question. I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I mean, the pessimistic answer is no, they can't do it. They will not have, as Professor Lawrence says, a sufficient challenge to get all the pieces together, and Japan, in decline, will last a very long time because it's a very rich country. And it's going to take a long, long time to put this country sort of in the poorhouse. The other, more optimistic view is that the Japanese will get it together, and then they have very great resources, I think primarily human resources, to take a very abrupt and effective turnaround, as they did in the oil crisis. Japan went into the oil crisis of the 1970s, the most dependent country in the world on energy, imported energy, of industrial states. And it came out of it, I think, arguably, that one of the more, Jim Schlesinger is here as Secretary of Energy, one of the more effective users of industrial energy in the world. And, you know, the period after the war we talked about, there are a lot of different, the Meiji Restoration, where Graham and others said, and Susan Farr said, they went out, they copied the German Army, the British Navy, the House of Lords, the German Civil Service, the French Civil Service. They didn't copy anything from us, as far as I know. But as a result, they transformed this. Huh?
They copied our management method.
In 1868? Yeah. Oh, well, I stand corrected. I'm glad that there was something they copied from us. But the point is that this is a society that has the capacity for change, perhaps most remarkably of any country in the world, to transform itself, to reinvent itself. And I think if the circumstances, again, present themselves, Japan will prove that once again.
Okay. Here on the left, please.
I'm Mayuko Toyota. I'm a Japanese government official and now studying at Harvard School of Public Health. And actually, I'm interested in the unbalanced relationship between U.S. and Japan. I mean, U.S. still tries to control us and impose American standard in the name of global standard. But I think it's some benefits to U.S. sometimes. For example, U.S. has required to open Japan's markets or military power sharing. I appreciate the importance of the theories, but you know, we have very delicate and complicated domestic affairs about these issues. So the protectionism and the pacifism is a very important theory for our history. So, for example, the Journal of the Foreign Affairs, the Brzezinski, the former presidential aide, stated that Japan is the U.S.'s vassal, the servant. I felt very sad to read that article, but I think it is true that some political or business or government leaders in U.S. still think so. So I believe Japan has still potential power, and Japanese sun will rise again. But to achieve it, it is essential to be confident and make decisions and strategies by ourselves, not by the external pressure. How do you think about this unbalanced relationship between U.S. and Japan? And what is a feasible solutions to solve the problem? Please tell me. Thank you.
Well, I would agree with you that this system whereby Americans exert gaiatsu, external pressure, and invoke change in Japan has never been a healthy one. I do not think we ought to be imposing our solutions on Japan. So I'm sympathetic with what you are saying. Where I would disagree with you respectfully, and I don't think I'm just talking as an ex-American official, is that in fact the protectionism which you mentioned is serving Japan well. I don't want to impose it, but I just want to tell you that Japan was able to do remarkably well for a long period of time despite its protectionism. It would have done even better, in my judgment, had it not had it. But today it's become dysfunctional. So just as one outsider observing Japan, I believe that it has to change fundamentally. And I also agree with you that the specific form in which the change will take, if it's going to be operational, has to come from the Japanese themselves. But so far, I have yet to see them capable of the decisive action. And so, you know, my conclusion, where I guess I differ with other people here, is that I still believe it's going to take a crisis. It could be a deep recession. It could be an explosion of inflation. I don't know what it's going to be. But I don't see that decisive galvanizing action which will cause the Japanese to take account of this by themselves. And by the way, it isn't going to be a foreign-imposed solution when it comes.
Lady on this side, please.
Thank you. My name is Iku Nagahori, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I have a security question regarding security to Ambassador Foley and D9. Although the importance of Japan-U.S. security treaty is clear, I personally believe that there's more that can be done to decrease the burden on the local communities, especially Okinawa. And it's been clear that disciplines in curfews and Marine doesn't really work anymore. And
Speak just a little closer to the microphone.
okay, I'm sorry. And it's been proven that disciplines and curfews and Marine do not function as a means to decrease the burden on local communities. And I was wondering if, one, decreasing the Marine deployment of Marine in Okinawa and still maintain the same force level is a feasible solution, and two, is amendment on status of U.S. forces agreement a possibility?
Well, the second is a very complicated question. I don't know if anybody wants to go through it. Status of force agreement is an agreement between the United States and the host country about the rights of individual members of the armed forces while they're serving in the country. The Japanese object sometimes to the fact that we don't turn over custody immediately of Americans charged with certain crimes. After the horrific rape in 1995, we agreed to turn over, prior to indictment, all those accused of heinous crimes like rape and murder. There is consideration to expanding that list to robbery, arson, and kidnapping. But we also have concerns on the Japanese side that have never been met. For example, Japanese police hold Japanese citizens for as much as 21 days without counsel and without intervention. That is contrary to every American tradition. And although the Japanese do not exert physical pressure on defendants in most cases, or accused persons, the psychological effects of isolation in the hands of police interrogation for a 3-week period is one of the reasons that 95% of all Japanese criminal defendants plead by confession, guilty. There are few criminal trials in Japan. Now, part of that is cultural, too, because the Japanese tend to believe that apology and confession is the first step toward rehabilitation. There are powerful cultural pressures to do that. But again, we have the problem of a clash of cultures here. We believe that our U.S. service people, if they're going to be in Japanese custody, ought to have interpreters and have, if not counsel, at least some representation. As far as the Marines are concerned, the problem here is largely, again, a demographic one. There are 17,000 Marines in Okinawa, the largest military force of our component force of our military in Japan. They are almost all males. They're almost all unaccompanied. That is, they don't have any family members. They're not married. They're 18 to 22 years of age. Under the circumstances, I really think the discipline is quite good. And I don't want to just dispute the fact that occasionally we've had horrific and terrible crimes committed by U.S. service personnel. Not all Marines, by the way. The most dramatic being the rape of a 12-year-old schoolgirl in 1995 in Okinawa. On the other hand, when there was a recent case of an American Marine who got drunk and fell on top of a 14-year-old schoolgirl and passed out, he didn't molest her or anything. It was a terrible story and a very serious problem. But the same week, an even more serious event occurred by an Okinawan against an Okinawan. It's hardly reported in the press. It's natural that after a period of almost half a century, having in your country a foreign military force of almost 50,000 people is going to create some serious tensions and problems. And that is particularly true in Okinawa, where we have so many of our forces and so many of our bases. One of the things that the famous Nye report suggested is the possibility of looking at the force levels and the training of our Marines. And in fact, some people have openly called for the withdrawal of the entire Marine force from Okinawa, relying on the presence of Air Force, Army, and naval elements to maintain the security requirements of the country. But again, I hate to say this, but because I'm not a press critic, I learned a long time ago in politics not to criticize the press. There are elements of the Japanese press that simply cannot, in my judgment, report unemotionally questions that relate to this kind of problem. Let me give you one quick example. A fight recently in a bar in Okinawa between an American civilian and an American naval person. In the course of that fight, the bar owner, 55 years of age woman, attempted to break up the fight. Not a very good idea. It happened at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she intervened, and she caught a stray punch, and her finger was broken. One of the leading Japanese papers reported that incident as follows. Something like, following a series of vicious attacks on Japanese citizens by American forces, a 55-year-old woman was brutally beaten by 2 Americans in a bar in Okinawa last week, suffering serious bodily injury. When she was attacked, her own establishment, da-da-da-da-da-da. You get to the last line, you find out her finger was broken, not something. The reason she intervened in the fight, she had a maternal friendship toward this young sailor. And she was terribly worried he was going to be injured in the fight. And she rushed in to stop the fight in order to save this favorite customer from getting beaten. And she was the first one to greet him when he came out of police captivity. So that story never gets told in Japan. And because there is an agenda of some journalists and others on this issue, we have a very serious problem, not of excusing the serious breaches of discipline that sometimes occur, but getting each one treated as another terrible outrage that's exaggerated. But I think the reality is that we have to look at how many Marines we have in Okinawa and the pressures that are placed there by their presence. And we have to think again about how we want to reconfigure that force, perhaps. Just a quick, Japanese government supports the security treaty, all parties except the communists. The Japanese public supports it by 75%. The Japanese government recently passed a special measures agreement that provides $1.5 billion a year for 5 years, $7.5 billion, to provide at total Japanese expense 23,000 employees of our bases, provides $300 million of assistance to the utility bills of American forces in Japan, and it was passed through the Diet with all parties supporting it, again, except the communists. So before you read the fact that the Japanese are ready to withdraw, we are very, very grateful for the support that the Japanese people have given to an alliance that really is one that's not symmetrical, but is one where each side makes important contributions.
I would just add a footnote on your question, which is it would be a mistake to withdraw the Marines from Okinawa so long as the situation in North Korea is as uncertain as it is. And as Ambassador Foley said, the situation on the ground in North Korea has not changed, even though the rhetoric may have changed somewhat. On the other hand, we don't need as many Marines in Okinawa as we have, and it's unwise for the long-term future of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty to put so much pressure on one particular part of the Japanese islands. And we should be, in fact, thinking of ways to thin out the presence of the Marines on Okinawa. We should be closing the Futemna Air Base, and we should think about ways to deploy some significant portion of the Marines in Guam or elsewhere.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent question and a very good answer. I'm in the dilemma of the moderator where the local work rules say that we should stop at 9:30, and so what I'm going to do is suggest that the people who are still standing in line come up after to make their questions to the members of the panel, and take the last minute and a half to see whether in wrap-up any of the members of the panel have any other bottom line that the conversation has raised for them on is Japan's sun setting, or some other metaphor. Joe, do you want to start out?
I would just reiterate what I said. Japan has a number of short-run problems, but I remain a long-run optimist. And I would add a footnote to that, which is to say that I think Tom Foley was a great ambassador, and I hope he'll be just as good a lecturer here as an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy.
Susan, what?
I don't think I have anything at this point to add, but I too would like to really, from among people like myself who work on Japan, it was just a pleasure to see Ambassador Foley serving in that post. He did a very distinguished job in a difficult time.
Bob?
Well, I think that although I gave a pessimistic prediction, I actually think that many of the Japanese problems are not insoluble, that kind of, with the right macroeconomic posture they could do much better. Recently, in fact, I think the other day, the Japan Economic Research Center put out 2 forecasts for Japan. They had a pessimistic for the next 25 years. The pessimistic forecast, they said if Japan continues to do what it is doing, it is likely to grow at 0.1% a year for the next 25 years. And then they said, if Japan does some sensible things, allow more women to work, change some of the tax rules. They had a few small changes, and they simulated that, and they got up to 1% a year. Well, I think they lacked a lot of imagination, because I do believe that with the right kind of policies, as opposed to what are they likely to do, if they took the right kind of policies, there is immense potential there. In fact, simply to realize the actual potential of the economy, it is so far below its potential today, not to invent new things, just to fully utilize the resources that are already there could give them significant growth. So it's something within their grasp if the action is taken.
I would just say amen to Professor Lance's last statement and say that I think the biggest threat to Japan is not the demography, it's not the economic policies that are fumbling, it's not even the dysfunctional political system. The greatest problem, I think, is Japanese confidence in the future itself. Because from time to time they do reports in the Japanese press about Japanese public opinion. And one of them recently asked, which country do you think will be number 2 in the world's economy if the United States remains number 1? A very significant part of the Japanese population said China. In fact, I think it was a larger number than said Japan. I don't believe that. I think 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, as far down as I can see, Japan will certainly be number 2, if not number 1. But the problem is, if the Japanese don't believe that is a problem, that none of us, friends of Japan, and I think it's very important for the United States that we have a strong Japan, a strong economic success in Japan, a strong future for Japan. That's in our interest, not just the Japanese interest. But that's the greatest thing I worry about.
Well, we're very pleased that Tom Foley is come home, even though he'll be missed sorely in the ambassador's role in Japan. His successor will be Howard Baker, who's been the leader of the Senate, which I think is some indication of the U.S. government's judgment about the importance of the U.S.-Japanese relationship. And once Tom gets here more regularly, maybe we'll have a rerun of this on the Japanese Phoenix. So thank you very much.
If they ever unleash Japanese women, we'll have a real problem.
Well,
They're all at the Kennedy School, I
I agree
see.
with that. You know, I think, again, in terms of the crisis, this may force something like greater use of women in the workforce, you know, because obviously that's one of the answers.
Tom,
The Japanese, yeah.
here's somebody who went to your high school.
Hey!
Yeah.